Yeah, I mean, so before we talk about mobile, we have to talk about the desktop, right? So, as designers, right, we've always looked at design of an interface through this window, right? Like, so basically, we always looked at user interface design. We looked at the screen, right, which is your desktop, and I think even today we spend a lot of time. We spend a lot of time working on this device right now. But I think the primary purpose is that we get work done, right? I think, but once this came along, which started off as a basic communication device, it's kind of turned into a full-fledged computing device, and it's evolved from a communication device. It's evolved as an extension of a desktop, and now it's kind of an extension of our lives. And therefore, I think it's much more than a screen, right? Like, you cannot look at, I think, from a design perspective, you can't just look at it as a screen, because it so naturally fits into our lives. And the fact that it's so inherently powerful, right? It's also, it's got so many services that plug into it. So, there's a lot more opportunity from a design perspective, right? I mean, you talk about the fact that it's got a camera, it has access to data from other apps. It has a whole lot of sensors, and the fact that it's getting more and more affordable makes it pretty much very exciting from a design and user experience perspective, right? And I think just to add to that, if you look at, if you think about the opportunities that exist, right? If you look at the physical world, there are so many things that, if you look at your own life, there are so many things that you need to get done, from, getting work done both on a work and personal front, which you talk about paying bills, you talk about doing laundry, you talk about buying things for your house, or, getting to places, learning and getting better. So, like, you talk about reading. There's so many sort of physical interactions that exist, that there's tremendous potential to kind of take that to this device and kind of do a good job with it, right? So I think it starts with, if you look at the opportunity that exists, it starts with really understanding the problem. So if you look deep into how you kind of interact in the physical world, you can look at, you can really sort of start looking at the problems that exist in the physical world and try to, eliminate all the friction that exists, right? We were talking about payments, right? Cash is a problem. So, basically, the problem is to go to an ATM, right? The ATM itself is not the problem, right? So if you're going and redesigning the ATM interface, you're getting it wrong. I think there's been a behavioral change in people. They hate going to the ATM. So, like, going and making the best possible ATM interface is not going to help anybody. So yeah, I think, so really kind of figuring out, where the problems lie. And I think when you talk about actually competing with interactions in the physical world, what you need to really do is actually set the right expectation, because all the stuff that you'll be doing will be very new to users from an interface perspective. So it needs to be like much easier and simpler, and fits into the sort of real world that the user is actually interacting with, right? So I'll give you an example. Like, when we basically redesigned this ticket, this was sort of this was the ticket that we had earlier on. But we looked at the life cycle of the ticket, right? From the time that the person actually prints it out till the time he actually gets a boarding pass issued, right? So they were kind of, the ticket went through multiple hands, right? From yourself, referring it to when your flight is, or you might have multiple tickets and sort of being able to figure out, when you're traveling and stuff like that, to, handing it to the security, to handing it to the person behind the counter, right? So there were like these different sort of problem statements that we wanted to tackle, and we looked at those and kind of redesigned the ticket, right? So I'm just saying that basically, like you have to kind of observe people in the real world, how they interact and in what context do they actually interact with anything, right? And then basically, if you look at all the touch points, there's a lot of opportunity from a design perspective. So, yeah, I mean, coming back to mobile and how you are kind of competing with interaction in the real world, right? So, I mean, we really need to aim this high. So, I'm thinking that basically what you need is, or what users need is basically a push button experience for whatever they do, right? So, if you think that people in today's generation are ready to kind of handle complexity, you're absolutely wrong, because basically what they really need is this experience. So whatever you're trying to do, this is what you should be aiming for. Like, you need to kind of get to the real basic level, right? So coming down to, I mean, a lot of people really ask me, how do you kind of do design at Cleartrip? And I think I was really thinking hard about this, and actually it boils down to 2-3 things, right? Like, first, we try to keep things as simple as possible, right? And as far as possible, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel. And we kind of try and focus on what's most critical to a particular problem. And if the problem demands, we actually try and break the rules as well, right? And all this combined with a lot of stress to details. So I've kind of tried to, through the presentation, said, okay, fine, can I come up with a checklist that takes care of hygiene factors, and then I'll be actually presenting some samples, right, which will kind of help you put things into place. Anyways, so when you're talking about aiming high, right, you look at a problem and then you see, you know, how can you get something done in the least possible sort of steps, right? So if I have to look at mobile specifically, right, you know, you think through a particular flow, what are the elements that you can actually completely do without, right? Or what are the fields that you can completely do without? How much of input that you can take from the device itself. The device obviously is very capable. So, you know, there are certain inputs that you can take directly from the device. Like, for example, geolocation. You don't have to ask the guy where he is and stuff like that, right? So I'll give you an example here. So this is basically our sort of, you know, flight bookings are sort of our bread and butter. And this is what our mobile site looks like, right? So we've kind of followed standards. You have the standard form fields and stuff like that, right? And you would probably want to translate this to a native experience, right? So you'll end up using standard components to kind of, you know, just have the same experience on a native app. But we said, you know what, we want to kind of compete with the dial pad, the phone dial pad, right? As in, we want searching for a flight as simple as this. So that's where we started, right? And it kind of, I mean, searching for a flight obviously is not as easy as dialing a phone number, but yeah, I mean, that was what we were aiming for. And then, you know, obviously there were elements like, okay, it has to be really touch friendly and stuff like that. So we've kind of made very large tappable areas and made sure that we've created a perception of fewer fields and stuff like that, right? So yeah, I mean, this was just an example to say, like, you know, your sort of benchmarks have to be really high in that sense if you want to get something, you know, simple. So, you know, I look at a lot of apps, and I think we underestimate some of the very basic things that make apps good, right? So, like, a lot of apps don't even sort of follow the standards that the platform itself actually recommend, right? So I think it's very important that before you actually get into, after you're done with figuring out, hey, you know what, this is, we've got the flow right, we've basically brought it down to the sort of, you know, bare minimum. I think it's important that you sensitize yourself with each platform and what it offers. and I think we do a lot of that. I think we spend a lot of time trying to sensitize ourselves to the platform itself, because I think it takes care of most of the hygiene factors. And you talk about typography, you talk about navigation design, you talk about treatment on iconography. I think all this kind of makes the interface a lot more familiar, and it helps users. I mean, it kind of reduces the sort of reduces the stress of someone trying to learn something from scratch. And of course, I mean, you've got to look at all the design patterns that exist and make sure that you're using components. You understand the usage of components from a semantic level, right? Like when you should use, say, for example, like a scope bar or whatever, right? So, I mean, they have different terminologies for each, terminologies for each platform, but it's important to understand why it's used and how it's used, in what context it needs to be used. So yeah, I mean, we actually start off, when we're looking for design inspiration, we actually don't look at different apps, but we look at apps, the native apps of the platform itself, right? So, how is the settings laid out in iOS, how a form field is laid out in iOS, if there is basically, a sort of a list view which has images, like what does that look like? What are the kind of typefaces people are using? What's the visual hierarchy in all these things, right? So I think it's important to start here. And I think then once, you've kind of taken care of all the basics, you've got to start looking at what's most critical to your app, right, or your product, and then you create your own standards for that. So for example, we wanted to create like a very sort of consistent way of, we wanted to create a very consistent way of searching for hotels, flights, and trains, right? And we came up with our own sort of design for a form field, right? And this is sort of moving towards creating our own standards and patterns, or basically even the itinerary, right? So basically you find commonality between data points, and basically you create your own standards that can kind of scale to different scenarios. So if you look at even our search results, each search result is a slightly different variation, but it kind of all looks cohesive. So you have a one-way domestic result, you have a round-trip domestic result, and you have an international result. Like there are different types of data points, but it kind of all flows into a single cohesive language. You've taken care of the hygiene factors, right? You've created your own patterns, right? You've made sure that your app is consistent across. Now it's time to break some rules. I think it's important to kind of not shy away from breaking rules, right? Especially when, it kind of makes the experience better. And I mean, that's how you actually evolve. That's how your sort of product will evolve. You cannot get stuck to basically all the patterns and design standards that you've set, right? Because I think context over consistency is really, really important at the same time. So, when we sort of designed our book flow, our checkouts flow, we had a sort of linear flow. You had screen by screen. So you look at your itinerary, you add on stuff, you enter your traveler details, and then sort of you make the payment, right? So this was our traditional sort of mobile sort of checkout process for a mobile device. But hotels is very different from a flight booking, right? It's much more straightforward. There are no, I mean, in flights, you could have multiple passengers, and therefore you need a separate screen for it. But in a hotel context, there's only one traveler. I mean, you just need to capture one traveler sort of information. Even if there are 5 people traveling, all you need is one guest name, primary guest name. So therefore, you can actually try out something totally different, right? So we moved into a single checkout screen, right? So basically it was a step sort of vertical experience. And I'm sure that now we can look at flights like this as well. But I think the idea was to actually make that attempt and try something which will work for the hotel use case, right? So yeah, I mean, I'm coming back to another example. I think So for example, here I was talking about consistency across how people search between trains, hotels, and flights. But recently, we had to actually add, I don't know, do you guys know that we now have weekend getaways that you can search from your apps? So we had to sort of add weekend getaways, and weekend getaways in a sense, so we had a lot of constraints, right? First of all, we want to stick to the tab bar because the tab bar on the iOS is kind of the most obvious. If we move into a hamburger menu, you guys know what a hamburger menu is, right? That's like the standard for Android. And if you wanted to move to a hamburger menu, you would land up one, it's not obvious what the app has, right? We wanted to make sure that at least all the 90% use cases, like for example, flights, hotels, trains, and trips, which are sort of the most used parts of the app, are upfront and people don't have to sort of find them. So we will continue to stick to a tab bar because I think like we're quite sure that moving to a hamburger menu is going to reduce the discoverability of these products. So, and now that we have weekend getaways, the weekend getaways fits into the sort of hotels use case, right? In fact, weekend getaways is nothing but a sort of repackaging of hotels itself, right? So now we want to bring in weekend getaways. We don't have a spot on the tab bar. We don't want to move it into the more thing because no one's going to discover it ever. So we've got to kind of somehow find a way to actually put it alongside, put it within hotels, but not create more choices for users, right? So more choices means you're going to see a dip in usage across the board, right? So, if I had to go traditional and you just kind of follow standards, you would do something like this, where you would have a hotels in and getaways from, like the one-way round trip type of a case. Or you would go with, like a sort of a menu before you get to a hotels or weekend getaways, right? So it's just basically a choices. But we said, how do we kind of break the rules here and, not, so first was we didn't want people to, we didn't want any dip in hotel searches itself, right? And we wanted weekend getaways also to be sort of discoverable. So we came up with something like this, which was the final design, which is there today, right? So with this, what we did is we created a perception of only two choices. If you think about it, there are a lot of things going on over here, right? Actually, here, just going back to the screen, you have hotels near you. You actually have a dateless search as well, right? So you can actually just, if you're someone who's not really decided where you want to go, you can just do a search. But again, this search form looks very intimidating for that person, right? If you've not decided when you want to go, this kind of forces you to think about dates and forces you to think about pick dates that you want to travel on. So we wanted to kind of, with the mobile, we wanted to encourage people to just kind of just explore hotels without having to worry about those dates, right? So this was the attempt. We basically just wanted people to enter a city and then uncover layers sort of step by step, right? So when a user lands up on the hotels thing, he has just two choices, right? Weekend getaways or hotels, and then you have your sort of hotels near me available as well, but it's not it's not perceived as too many options in front of them. And then as the user decides to do something, you actually uncover other options, right? So here also travel dates is optional, but if you're the kind of guy who knows when he wants to travel, you'll have more options, right? Versus like a screen like this where you're kind of forced to think about like a booking itself. So we wanted to obviously encourage people to explore hotels and stuff like that, right? So I think you could always swipe weekend getaways up, and then we're doing a lot of searches in the background, and then finally you can start exploring weekend getaways. So this is what weekend getaways looks like. But I think the point is that just trying to break that pattern. One was it didn't affect So we're not very happy with the sort of numbers that this has given us. I mean, in terms of adoption of weekend getaways itself. But I think the good thing is, in spite of adding one more choice, we've not, there are no drop in numbers in hotels itself. If we tried to actually put too many options on the same screen, we would probably see a dip in hotels itself. So right now, I would not say that weekend getaways is sort of getting the adoption that we would like it to, but I'm sure that we've taken a leap, and I think taking that leap has kind of already put us to a certain level, and then obviously you can do incremental stuff from there, right? So yeah, I mean, I think just to sum up, right, it's critical to sort of really understand the context in which you're building something. And I think don't underestimate sort of all the hygiene factors. I think the devil is in the details, and I mean, we spend a lot of time, effort, sort of just looking at all the basics and making sure the basics are right. Right? And yeah, I mean, break rules when you have to. And like for us, we've always, sweat the details, and we're always striving for beauty. And that's, I think, what makes our app sort of where it is, right? So I think there's no real, beyond that, there's nothing really, as in, like, honestly speaking, there's not much. This is pretty much, I've tried to sum up, how we work, and I hope it was helpful. Okay, thanks.